The jet engine test site was a fortress of cold steel, hidden behind high-security fences. A prototype engine worth hundreds of millions sat in the center, a massive beast refusing to breathe. Three teams of world-class experts stood around glowing screens, faces pale under flickering lights. The chief engineer shook his head, sweat dripping onto his metal clipboard. The CEO sighed, whispering, "We've tried everything." In the corner, a single dad in a faded uniform sat quietly. He was just part of the cleaning crew. The engine roared once, then died. "You're listening to the wrong sound," he said. Everyone turned. Aaron Cole was 43 years old, a man whose physical appearance told a story of exhaustion, resilience, and a life lived in the shadows of an industry that had once hailed him as a prodigy. His hands were thick with calluses, and his eyes carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights spent worrying about bills, rent, and the future of his 8-year-old daughter, Emma. To the high-powered executives and elite scientists in the testing hangar, he was nothing more than a ghost in a blue jumpsuit, a temporary contract worker hired to sweep up the metallic dust and keep the floors clear of debris. They saw a janitor. They did not see the man who once held a doctorate in fluid dynamics and had pioneered the very concepts of high-altitude propulsion that they were currently struggling to master. Aaron had been raising Emma alone since his wife passed away in a tragic accident at a construction site, a victim of the same corporate negligence and corner cutting that Aaron had spent his career fighting against. After her death, the light in his world had dimmed, leaving only the fierce, protective love he held for his daughter. He had once been a rising star at this very company, a lead engineer on the foundation of this engine project. But Aaron had a fatal flaw in the eyes of the corporate board. He possessed an unbreakable moral compass. Years ago, when the project hit a major snag, the directors had demanded that he smooth over the data and adjust the safety margins to satisfy the investors and meet a desperate deadline. Aaron had refused, looking the CEO of that time in the eye and telling him that the design was fundamentally unstable. In retaliation, they didn't just fire him, they erased him. His records were purged, his patents were credited to others, and a non-disclosure agreement combined with a quiet industry blacklist ensured he would never design a turbine again. He disappeared without a fight, choosing the peace of a quiet life with Emma over the toxic battles of a boardroom that valued profit over human life. He took whatever manual labor he could find, eventually ending up as a janitor because it allowed him to work late shifts and be home when Emma woke up for school. On this particular morning, he was only supposed to be working the perimeter of the hangar, staying out of the way of the real professionals. But as the hours dragged on and the experts grew more frantic, Aaron found himself unable to switch off his engineering brain. He sat on a crate in the corner, his broom leaning against the wall, and he began to listen. He didn't need the glowing arrays of sensors or the complex heat maps projected on the walls. He had spent 20 years studying the language of machines, and to him, the engine wasn't a collection of data points. It was a living, breathing organism with its own voice. While the chief engineer screamed about fuel ratios and the software specialists rebooted their systems for the 5th time, Aaron focused on the rhythm of the intake. He heard a tiny, almost imperceptible whistle that shouldn't have been there. It was a high-frequency stutter, a hitch in the mechanical breath of the beast that suggested the internal airflow was being choked by a ghost in the control logic. He watched the best minds in the country chase their tails for 3 hours, their egos preventing them from looking at the machine itself. They were obsessed with the digital representation of reality, while the physical truth was screaming at them from the turbine core. Aaron stayed silent, knowing that his voice meant nothing in a room full of degrees and titles. But then he saw the CEO, Sarah Vance, walk toward the observation window with a look of such profound defeat that it reminded him of his own darkest days. He knew that if this test failed, the factory in the neighboring town would close, thousands of families would lose their livelihoods, and the world would lose a piece of technology that could change the future. He thought of Emma's future, and for the first time in a decade, the engineer inside him overrode the janitor. He stood up, the metal floor cold beneath his boots, and walked toward the center of the room. The tension in the hangar was thick enough to choke on. The air smelled of ozone, burnt kerosene, and the sharp, bitter scent of collective failure. The lead specialists were huddled around a central terminal, their voices rising in a frantic, disjointed symphony of technical jargon. "The thermal load is within the green zone," one shouted, his hands trembling as he refreshed the logs. "The fuel pressure is holding steady at 3,000 psi," another retorted, slamming his fist against the desk. They were looking at a puzzle where all the pieces seemed to fit, yet the picture they were trying to build kept shattering every time they applied power. Sarah Vance, the CEO, felt a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. This project was her legacy, her promise to the shareholders that the company could still innovate. But as she watched the chief engineer wipe sweat from his brow and stare blankly at his clipboard, she realized that they were blind. They were following a map that no longer matched the terrain. One of the senior consultants, a man whose reputation was built on decades of theoretical papers, stepped back from the console and sighed. "Maybe the model is simply impossible, Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with a defeatist weariness. "Perhaps we've reached the limit of what this specific alloy can handle. The physics might just not be there yet." The frustration in the room reached a boiling point as computer models failed to account for the physical reality of the machine. These men were giants of the industry, yet they were trapped in a loop of digital error messages. They scrutinized every line of code, ignoring the metallic groans and the sharp, inconsistent clicking emanating from the combustion chamber. They were blinded by their own brilliance, unable to see that the solution wasn't hidden in a database, but in the raw, unrefined feedback of the engine itself. Aaron stood behind the yellow safety line, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jumpsuit. He listened to them talk about the limits of physics and felt a surge of quiet frustration. It wasn't the physics that was failing, it was the people. They were treating the engine like a math equation on a chalkboard, rather than a physical object subject to the laws of the universe. He knew the answer wasn't in the alloy or the fuel pressure, it was in the harmonic resonance, a phenomenon where vibrations build upon themselves until they create a wave of energy strong enough to disrupt the most delicate sensors. He could feel the vibration in the soles of his shoes every time the engine hummed, a low-frequency thrum that told him exactly where the energy was being trapped. He saw the security team beginning to move toward him, their eyes sharp and suspicious. They were trained to see a man in a maintenance uniform as a potential threat or a nuisance, never as a source of information. Aaron didn't wait for them to reach him. He took 2 long strides forward, crossing the line that separated the labor from the intellect. "If you run it again like this," he said, his voice projecting with a sudden, sharp clarity that silenced the bickering engineers, "the vibration will hit the critical resonance point within 10 seconds, and the entire core will tear itself apart. You won't just fail the test, you'll destroy the prototype and likely take out half this hangar with it." A stunned silence washed over the room. The chief engineer looked up, his eyes bloodshot and confused. "Who the hell is this?" he demanded, looking at the security guards. "Why is the cleaning crew talking to me about resonance?" One of the younger specialists let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Hey, buddy, maybe stick to the mop. This is a $100 million piece of hardware, not a broken vacuum cleaner." But Sarah Vance didn't laugh. She saw the way Aaron was standing, shoulders back, chin up, eyes fixed on the turbine, with a level of concentration that was almost unnerving. She had spent her life around geniuses, and she recognized the look of a man who saw something no one else could see. "Wait," Sarah commanded, her voice ringing out over the hum of the cooling fans. She walked toward Aaron, her heels clicking rhythmically on the concrete. She stood inches from him, looking at the grease stains on his collar and the raw intelligence in his gaze. "You sound very certain for a man who isn't on the payroll as an engineer. What makes you think our sensors are lying to us?" Aaron didn't blink. He pointed at the engine's main housing. "Your sensors aren't lying. They're just being shouted over. You're looking for a fire, but you should be looking for a heartbeat that's out of sync." Numb. For a split second, the room hung in a state of suspended animation. A freeze moment where the future of the company rested on the decision of a woman to trust a man the world had told her to ignore. Sarah Vance was a woman who had fought her way to the top of a male-dominated industry by trusting her instincts. And right now, her instincts were telling her that the man in the dirty blue jumpsuit was the most dangerous, and perhaps the most brilliant, person in the room. She ignored the frantic whispers of her advisors and the indignant huffs of the lead engineers. "I will give you 60 seconds," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the storm of chaos. "Tell me exactly what we are missing, and if you're wrong, you leave this facility and never return." Aaron didn't hesitate. He didn't need 60 seconds. He walked toward the engine, and for a moment the experts held their breath, expecting him to break something. But Aaron moved with a grace that only comes from years of intimate familiarity with machinery. He didn't look at the data walls. He didn't even glance at the primary terminals. He walked straight to the auxiliary cooling port and leaned his head close to the metal casing, his eyes closed, his entire being focused on the internal hum of the idling turbines. He reached out and tapped a specific bolt on the compressor housing, a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the silent hangar. "Your problem is right here," Aaron stated, his voice now carrying the weight of an undisputed expert. "The auxiliary pressure sensor on the secondary bypass is mounted too close to the main fuel line. It's picking up the mechanical vibration of the pump and interpreting it as a pressure drop. Your software sees that drop and tries to compensate by flooding the chamber with more fuel, which creates a rich mixture, which then causes the temperature spike. The computer panics and shuts down to prevent a meltdown that isn't actually happening. You're chasing a ghost created by a bad mounting bracket." As he spoke, Aaron's fingers danced across the cold steel with a familiarity that chilled the onlookers. He explained that the resonance wasn't just a vibration. It was a rhythmic interference that occurred only when the turbine blades hit a specific rotational velocity. The experts stood paralyzed as this man, whom they had treated as invisible for weeks, began deconstructing their complex algorithms with the simple logic of a master craftsman. He pointed out that the thermal expansion of the housing at high speeds was shifting the sensor just enough to trigger a false positive in the emergency shutdown sequence. It was a flaw that lived in the tiny gap between theoretical physics and the messy reality of moving parts. The room erupted. "That's impossible," the senior consultant shouted. "Those sensors are shielded. They've been tested in a vacuum." Aaron turned to face him, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "They were tested in a vacuum, but they weren't tested while attached to a turbine spinning at 30,000 RPM's physics changes when the metal starts to scream. In a lab, everything is perfect. Out here, on the floor, you have to account for the heat, the humidity, and the way the metal expands when it's pushed to its breaking point. You've built a masterpiece, but you forgot that masterpieces still have to live in the real world." He turned back to the technicians. "Tear out the bypass on the secondary sensor. Use the manual override to adjust the intake vanes by exactly 0.7 degrees to compensate for the air density in this room. Then, and only then, hit the ignition." Aaron stood back, his eyes fixed on the core, his ears already tuned to the frequency he knew was coming. The chief engineer looked at Sarah, his face a mask of disbelief. "We can't just bypass safety sensors on a whim, Sarah. This is madness. If he's wrong, this whole wing of the building could go up in flames." But Sarah saw the logic in Aaron's eyes. She saw the simple, elegant truth of his diagnosis, a truth that none of her high-priced consultants had been able to grasp. "Do it," she ordered. "Now!" The next 10 minutes were the longest of Aaron's life. He watched as the technicians, grumbling and skeptical, followed his instructions with trembling hands. They bypassed the faulty sensor and tilted the vanes with surgical precision. The hangar lights flickered as the massive starter motors began to whine, a rising pitch that usually ended in a sputter of failure. But this time, the sound was different. It was a smooth melodic climb, a pure golden note of power that lacked the jagged edges of previous attempts. The engine reached 50% power, then 60, then 70. The data walls, which had previously been a chaotic mess of red warnings, were now a sea of steady, calm green. As the engine hit 100% thrust, the floor of the hangar began to vibrate with a powerful, rhythmic force. It wasn't the violent shaking of a failing machine. It was the heartbeat of a world-changing invention. The experts stood frozen, their mouths open, staring at the screens that proved the janitor had just solved a problem they had spent a year and $100 million failing to understand. The roar was magnificent, a sustained, thunderous applause from the machine itself. In the back of the room, an older engineer who had been with the company for 20 years slowly took off his glasses. He walked over to a secure terminal and began frantically typing. He was looking for something, a name, a face, a memory from a time before the corporate purges. He found a file from 15 years ago, a photograph of a young, confident engineer standing in front of a whiteboard covered in revolutionary equations. He looked at the photo, then looked at the man in the blue jumpsuit who was currently watching the engine with a look of quiet satisfaction. "My God," the old engineer whispered, his voice trembling so much it could barely be heard over the roar of the turbine. "That's not a janitor. That's Aaron Cole. He didn't just find the fix. He's the one who designed the original principle of the entire project before the board blacklisted him." The revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave. The janitor was the true architect, the father of the machine, the genius who had been erased by the very people now begging for his help. The power in the room didn't just shift, it shattered. The hierarchy of titles and degrees meant nothing. There was only the truth, the engine, and the man who knew how to make it sing. The engine continued its perfect, deafening roar for 20 minutes, passing every stress test and performance metric with flying colors. When the shutdown sequence was finally initiated, the silence that followed was even more profound than before. Every eye in the hangar was fixed on Aaron Cole. He stood in the center of the workspace, his hands once again tucked into his pockets, looking as though he had just finished a routine day of sweeping floors. Sarah Vance approached him slowly. She was no longer the imposing CEO. She was a woman humbled by the sheer scale of the brilliance she had almost discarded. She knew the history now. The old engineer had whispered the truth into her ear while the test was running. She knew her company had committed a grave injustice against this man, and she knew that his presence here today was a miracle of chance. "Aaron," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "there are no words to apologize for what this company did to you. We stole your work, we destroyed your career, and we forced a man of your caliber to sweep our floors." She took a deep breath, her eyes pleading. "I want to fix this. I am offering you the position of Chief Technology Officer. I will give you a salary that reflects your true worth, 20 times what you are making now. I will give you a seat on the board, a massive stake in the company's future, and the power to fire anyone in this room who ever doubted you. We need you, Aaron. The world needs this engine, and only you can lead us there." The experts and specialists stood in a semicircle, their heads bowed in a mixture of shame and expectation. They expected him to jump at the offer. They expected him to celebrate his return to the world of the elite. But Aaron didn't smile. He didn't look at the high-tech consoles or the promises of wealth. He thought of Emma, sleeping in their small, cramped apartment, dreaming of a father who worked hard and kept his word. He thought of the nights he had spent in the cold, dark corners of this very factory, realizing that the people at the top didn't care about the machines or the workers. They only cared about the image of success. "I don't want your office," Aaron said, his voice quiet but carrying a strength that filled the entire hangar. "And I certainly don't want a seat on a board that values profit over integrity. You didn't fail today because of a censor. You failed because you stopped listening to the truth. You stopped valuing the people who actually do the work." He looked at Sarah Vance, his gaze piercing. "I will help you finish this engine, but not for a title and not for the money. I will do it on my terms. First, you will release a public statement acknowledging the original designers of this project. You will clear my name and the names of the other engineers you purged to save your margins. Second, you will overhaul your safety and testing protocols. You will hire people who know how to listen to the machines, not just people who know how to manipulate data to please investors. And finally," Aaron added, a hint of a smile appearing on his face, "I want to be a consultant, an independent one. I work when I want, and I stay home when my daughter needs me. I'm not joining your corporate ladder, Sarah. I've already seen what's at the top, and I prefer the view from where I am." The CEO looked at the man who had just turned down a multi-million-dollar life to remain a father first. She saw a level of integrity she hadn't encountered in decades. "I agree," she whispered. "To all of it." Over the next few months, Aaron worked with the team as a ghost consultant. He walked into the labs in his simple clothes, fixed the most complex problems in minutes, and then left in time to pick Emma up from school. He was no longer invisible. He was the soul of the project, the man who stayed in the shadows by choice, ensuring that the technology would serve the people, not just the bottom line. The day the first commercial aircraft took flight using the Colvance engine was a day of international celebration. The news was filled with images of the sleek, powerful machine soaring through the clouds, hailed as the most efficient and safest propulsion system ever created. Thousands of jobs had been saved, a town's economy had been revived, and a new era of aviation had begun. The media spoke of a miraculous turnaround and a triumph of modern engineering, often crediting the brilliant leadership of the corporation. But far away from the cameras and the champagne toasts, Aaron Cole was sitting on a park bench, the afternoon sun warming his face. He wasn't wearing a suit, and he didn't have a trophy on his mantle. He was watching Emma run through the grass, her laughter a brighter, more beautiful sound than any engine could ever produce. He had used the money from his consulting contract to buy a small, comfortable house with a garden and a workshop where he and Emma could build things together. Emma ran over to him, her face flushed with excitement, clutching a small wooden bird they had carved the day before. "Daddy," she cried, climbing onto the bench beside him. "Did they hear it? The big engine? Did they hear the sound you told them to listen for?" Aaron pulled her into his arms, resting his chin on her head. The world might not know his name, and the history books might only mention him in a footnote, but in the eyes of the only person who truly mattered, he was a hero. "They heard it, Emma," he whispered. "They finally stopped talking and started listening. And because they did, the world is a little bit safer today." He looked at her, his expression serious but filled with love. "I want you to remember something, okay? Never let anyone, no matter how many degrees they have or how expensive their suit is, tell you that what you hear isn't real. If you know the truth in your heart, you stand by it. The truth doesn't need a loud voice to be right. It just needs someone who refuses to let it go." The media eventually moved on to the next big story, and the team of experts took their bows in the limelight. Aaron Cole remained a mystery to the public, a phantom genius who had saved an industry and then vanished back into the life of a single father. But within the walls of the company's laboratories, things had changed. There was a new culture of respect, a new focus on the physical reality of engineering, and a quiet, unwritten rule that if a man in a maintenance uniform ever had something to say, you stopped everything and you listened. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the park, Aaron stood up and took Emma's hand. Emma's. They walked toward their car, two small figures against the vast horizon. Somewhere high above them, a jet streaked across the sky, leaving a white trail of vapor in its wake. The sound was faint, a steady, perfect hum that vibrated in the air. Aaron didn't need to look up to know that the engine was running perfectly. He could hear it. He had always been able to hear it. And as they drove away, the world kept turning, finally tuned to the right frequency, all because one man had the courage to tell the experts they were listening to the wrong sound. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that the truth is often found in the quietest voices, then you belong here with us. Sometimes being a hero doesn't mean standing in the spotlight. It means standing by those you love and never losing your integrity. For more stories of fatherhood, resilience, and the quiet strength that heals the world, don't forget to follow our journey. Subscribe and join the community at Daddy Healing Stories, where every father's love is a masterpiece and every quiet moment tells a story. We'll see you in the next one.